Thank you, Carrie, and thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Future of Engineering Roundtable. And today we are going to cover the topic of QBS, near and dear to all of our hearts, and especially to our panelists, I know. We did have a similar session to this at the fall conference in October, and this group did a great job of talking us through the study results that the Institute released earlier this year, as well as sharing some examples and having some conversation with the audience. So we are looking forward to doing that here again today. I do want to thank the ACEC Research Institute donors who make these sessions possible, make the research possible. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. So a big shout out to them. And please use that chat box or the Q&A box, as Carrie mentioned. I'll be monitoring that to help the panel along, but we would like you to engage with us. So the panel is ready for your questions. So please get those teed up, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Michael Sullivan, known to those dear and near to him as Sully. And he is the president and CEO of ACEC Georgia. Sully was instrumental in helping us get through this enormous research project along with our research team, and really helped lead that effort. So Sully, thank you for being with us. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce your panel and get us started.
Thank you, Daphne, and thanks to each of you for being with us today for what we hope will be an informative and engaging and interactive session. We do want you guys to engage and interact. If you have a question, don't feel like you have to wait till the end to submit that. Submit that in the chat function at any time, and we'll try to answer those as they come up. So we do want it to be lively and engaging and interactive, so please help us do that. We do have a great panel today. Let me introduce to you Dr. Paul Chanowski, Professor Emeritus in Civil Engineering for the University of Colorado Boulder, Van Collins, President and CEO of ACEC Washington, and Matt Reifer, Vice President of Infrastructure Programs at ACEC National. So we got a rock star panel, but before we get started, a little history I think is in order, particularly this year. This is the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Brooks Act. Actually, October 27th was the 50th anniversary of President Nixon signing the Brooks Act into law. Of course, that was called the Brooks Act because it was introduced by Congressman Jack Brooks from Texas. And that has been the law of the land at the federal level since 1972, 50 years now. Shortly after the Brooks Act was passed at the federal level, most every state enacted what we call a mini Brooks Act. In fact, currently all but 4 states have a mini Brooks Act that requires the use of QBS at the state level. And a majority of those states also require the use of QBS to procure design professional services at the local government level. So despite the strong legal support for QBS that's out there, the reality is that enforcing and protecting and possibly even trying to expand the use of QBS is something that your ACEC national staff and your ACEC state executive directors spend a tremendous amount of time on a weekly basis sometimes. It's really a never-ending mission. And the reason for that is because QBS is not intuitive. Low bid is very intuitive. A third grader could understand low bid, lowest price, pick that one. And QBS is not that simple for someone who's not experienced and who doesn't understand the justifications for it to understand. But the good news is that almost every time when you sit down with an elected or appointed official and you explain why QBS is the best way to procure design services and the best way for the owner or client, that's a key point I think that we want to make. It's the best way and provides the best options and best results for the owner and client. They usually understand that, and they usually get that, and they usually become converts and passionate defenders and protectors of QBS once they understand why it is the best way for them to procure design services. But one of the most powerful tools in having those conversations successfully with local and state elected and appointed officials is research. And if there was a QBS Hall of Fame, Paul Chanowski and Gordon Kingsley, the authors of the report we're going to talk about today, might be second only to Congressman Brooks in the QBS Hall of Fame. They are the ones that authored a landmark QBS study back in 2009 In that study, they compiled a database of roughly 200 public and private construction projects in 23 different states. The project types included transportation, water, commercial, industrial projects. The projects ranged in size from relatively small projects to projects that were costing hundreds of millions of dollars. And they compared various procurement methods, including QBS, best value, and low bid, to see which resulted in better results for the client. And they looked at factors such as total project cost, projected life cycle costs, construction schedule, and project quality outcome, which at the end of the day is what it's all about. And that 2009 study concluded that the research clearly demonstrated that using QBS resulted in the best results for owners. And to quote that research project, consistently meant lower overall construction costs, reduced change orders, better project results, and more highly satisfied owners than in other procurement methods. Pretty good result. And then as states and national, ACC National continued to fight these QBS battles over many years since 2009. In recent years, it became clear that it would be helpful to update that 2009 study to determine if those conclusions still held true. It was also thought that it might be helpful to provide an additional focus on local government projects, as well as to incorporate some of the QBS research, other QBS research that had occurred in the years since that landmark 2009 study. And fortunately for our industry and fortunately for our ACEC members, the ACEC Research Institute came to the rescue to provide the funding and the leadership to make this study happen. And we cannot thank them enough for doing that. But instead of just talking about the study, why don't I let the expert speak on this new QBS study, its goals, its conclusions. And with that, let me turn over to QBS Hall of Fame member, Paul Chanowski. Paul, take it away.
All right. Thanks,
Paul,
Sally.
if I may just interrupt, I've just been notified. So it seems the chat has been disabled. So if you have questions, just use the Q&A box and we'll be monitoring that as well. So I just wanted to make that announcement. I apologize, Paul.
No problem. There we go. I was just sharing my screen with everyone. It's nice to be able to talk to this audience about one of my favorite topics, QBS. And as Sully said, this was a second look at the topic a decade later. What had changed? What was still consistent? And so I'm going to give an overview, and it's really to set the stage, really to have some main takeaways as to what you can learn, what needs to be still done, and provide a context for the rest of the speakers on the panel. So there we go. So as Sully said, this was done with Gordon Kingsley at Georgia Tech, and I did this. We were both the original study authors, and we came back together a decade later to do this. And three big questions, decade later, that we were looking at. Is QBS still advantageous from a financial perspective? Does it still make sense monetarily to use QBS? Why is it being questioned? Why are some people doing other things? And what types of projects benefit from this? These are basic research questions, and they were very similar to what we originally asked. And we were saying, well, what's the state of it today? And the answers were not necessarily surprising. They were pretty consistent with the original. And at a high level, QBS saves money. You still find, and I can go with some numbers in just a minute, but ultimately QBS financially is the way you should go on projects. It also saves time. And one of the things that you're going to see in just a moment that I'm going to talk about in detail is bottom line with QBS projects. When you have an experienced team that's working together, qualified team, they produce better documents that end up with better constructed projects. We see that across all types of projects. They're also more innovative. QBS brings teams that bring more innovation to projects. So they cost less, they have better schedules, they're more innovative, and they simplify and address complex project issues. Everything from emerging social issues to technical complexity, they do a better job in terms of addressing these. And ultimately, it drives procurement. QBS gives a framework that everything from a local jurisdiction to a federal project can follow. So those are top line. Let's go into them a little bit more in depth. Current use of QBS. That was a question we started out with, just like we did a decade ago. Where is QBS being used? And we asked this from QBS directors across the country. And one of the things that was important that we found were when we get to the state level, state agencies, really that's where you are seeing high levels of compliance, especially federally funded projects to the states. You're seeing very, very high usage. States with 80 to 100% use, you're seeing 34 up into the 40s. Where it drops a little is when you get to county and municipal and smaller districts, smaller staff. It's not that they necessarily have anything against QBS in most cases. They're just not informed that this is really the way to go and the advantages. So there's some education problem. And you see a number of states with 40% or less in use. It really is in the school districts, very local jurisdictions. So we see kind of a dichotomy. Higher level state, federal, lots of staffs. This is where you get almost universal use. It drops down as you get to local. Now, big part of this, I said, was education. What we're finding is people need to understand at all different levels, even up at the legislative levels, right? And it comes back, QBS saves money. And in fact, when you look at it, you have half the overall cost growth that you find in non-QBS projects. Half. That's a huge advantage. Cost growth nationally on overall, when you go across, 6% cost growth in projects. Now, a lot of them go much higher, but we're just taking a national across the board. QBS cuts that in half to 3%. Now, the more complex the project, the greater the cost savings is. But across all projects, you find cost savings. QBS just plainly does better, outperforms national average. Same thing on time. Typically, again, we're using national averages. QBS projects are 30% less time increase than non-QBS projects. 30%. That is a big number, 30%. And the other one, half the projects of QBS that are done with QBS meet all milestones with no adjustments, right? Think about that. 50% of QBS projects hit their milestones without any adjustments. That's huge. Bottom line to this, QBS teams perform better by producing better documents that result in smoother, faster construction. So we've got saves costs, saves time. It addresses complexity. All projects are getting more complex, not just technically, new innovations, but also with addressing social issues, addressing community issues. There are a wide variety, media issues. And the bottom line, what we find is QBS benefits all projects. But the more complex the project, the more issues that are involved, the more QBS is a benefit. And we found this in multiple case studies, cases that happened on projects that were on college campuses, projects that were working with local jurisdictions to get more grant money, projects that were in potentially controversial areas, lots of different ideas on what solutions would be. The QBS teams came together and had solutions to some of these complexities before the projects even started. That was an advantage. Saves time, saves money, addresses complexity. Innovation. We want projects to be more innovative. We at least want project owners to understand that innovation is an opportunity. It may not ultimately be put in place, some new innovative solution, but we should at least be aware of what the opportunities are. And what we find with QBS projects is the teams bring far more innovation to the project, which the owners then are much more satisfied with the final solution, the final project that gets implemented. So innovation grows with QBS. Better solutions, more technically innovative solutions. This is what leads to owner satisfaction. So in summary, and I'm just going to stop sharing here for a second. In summary, what did we find? We found that QBS projects bring a team together that produces better documents, more innovative solutions, addresses the complexity, and the end result is it saves time, 30% less schedule growth. It saves cost, 50% less cost growth. And it ends up with more satisfied project. We see that owners, about twice the level of non-QBS projects, have high levels of satisfaction, but more importantly, the levels of dissatisfaction drop off significantly. QBS teams lead to better solutions, and that's the bottom line. A decade later, we're still seeing that. We have some education work to do at smaller jurisdictions, smaller municipalities. We have some education work. But across the board, project types, project location, project scale, all see similar results. It is still a decade later what should be implemented. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sully.
Thanks, Paul. So that's a lot, right? We got a lot to unpack today. So let's start to unpack it. Certainly the research, the fundamental research that supports the benefits of QBS that Dr. Chanowski went through are a powerful tool in these conversations with clients and with owners and with elected officials. Another powerful tool that we have in our arsenal is ACEC National and their advocacy staff who are fighting for protection and expansion of the Brooks Act at the federal level, all sorts of things in the QBS space. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Matt Reifer to provide that federal perspective and some ideas about how ACEC National assists states and firms relative to QBS issues around the country. Matt, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Sully. I appreciate that. And thanks, Dr. Chanowski, for that overview and for the tremendous work that you've done in this space for us. Yeah, building on what Sully mentioned in his introduction, QBS is a threshold core priority for ACEC at the national level, and then in partnership with our member organizations at the state level, starting with protection and expansion of the Brooks Act with respect to federal agency procurement. That is a core function of the national organization, is to make sure that federal agencies are complying with requirements under the federal acquisition regulation as outlined in the Brooks Act legislation. And then we've also, from a legislative standpoint, looked to push down those requirements to comply with QBS when it's state and local entities that are managing or utilizing federal dollars. So we have been successful in the decades following passage of the Brooks Act to attach those same QBS requirements and that framework to things like the Federal Aid Highway Program, the Federal Transit Program, airport improvement under the FAA, as well as wastewater revolving loan fund under the Clean Water Act. So these are federal funds, but the procurement is handled, project delivery is handled by a state or local entity. They also have to then comply with those same requirements. So part of our effort, and we consistently look for other opportunities to expand those same requirements to additional federal funds that are being distributed to state and local governments from an advocacy standpoint. And then on the back end, then we work on the compliance. So the national organization, again, collaborates very closely with the executive directors like Sully and Van and their counterparts in the other states on compliance. And that ranges from a wide array of services and engagement. It starts with technical assistance. I think on a weekly basis, I hear from the member organizations, they'll send me an RFP and ask, hey, does this comply? Is this engineering and design related services? Do they have to follow Brooks? And is this consistent with what's required under federal rules and regulations? Or similarly, we'll get proposed change in a departmental policy, whether it's the DOT or a local entity that's rewriting their procurement manual, and they want a perspective on whether that's compliant with what's expected. So we provide that technical assistance and review. And then, depending on the outcome of that, we will decide on a path forward. We'll collaborate again closely with the state. If there's intervention that's necessary, if it's not compliant, we can take a number of different routes, whether it's the ACEC national communicating directly with the agency official or procurement folks, whether that's done through the state organization, whatever the best approach is there, whoever has the right relationships. Is it friendly? Most of these instances, as Paul indicated, it's a matter of education. You have procurement folks who don't know or don't understand what's expected. In some cases, it is hostile, and it is a move away from what we would want to see, and then we can respond as necessary. What's really important for the firms to understand, and this is a benefit of membership within ACEC, is that we're doing this under the ACEC banner. This is our role and our responsibility as the trade association to intervene on your behalf. It allows you to maintain those really essential client relationships that we're the bad guy, calling these folks to task and not you. And you can stay in the background. So that's always on the forefront of our approach to these types of issues. And then the other role that we can play at the national level is intervening and collaborating with the relevant federal agencies, whether it's the Federal Highway Administration or Federal Transit Administration, who are overseeing and managing those dollars. We've got great relationships with those agency officials, and we can work with them to intervene where there are violations or challenges. Oftentimes, obviously, that is much more persuasive and influential than having a trade organization do that. If you've got the feds coming in and saying, hey, this isn't compliant, you need to change, that obviously goes a long way to getting a course correction, which is great. So we'll just, we'll decide on a case-by-case basis when we're being reactive to a challenge, what is the best way to intervene? But again, that's a really essential role that we play. And then proactively, again, we have resources that we can bring to bear when we're looking to expand QBS at the state local level. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in terms of some of the resources that are available now through the Research Institute. But that's a quick overview, and I'll turn it back to Sully.
Thanks, Matt. Well, hopefully you're getting a sense of how ACEC National and the states work closely together constantly all the time on these issues, and probably a good idea to provide that state perspective as well. So I want to turn things over to Van Collins, who's the president and CEO of ACEC Washington, to describe some of the recent QBS battles that they've had in Washington, and kind of that what that's like, boots on the ground at the state level, that constant challenge of educating agencies, particularly with tremendous staff turnover. Van, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Sully. And I do want to reiterate that, at the state level, that the education component, the support component that Matt was referring to at the federal level is exactly the same. We try to institute all of those various kind of things here. The why of QBS and the constant education. And even when I'm going out and trying to demonstrate a particular jurisdiction is not complying with QBS, I try to do it in a way, generally speaking, that's educational. So that's number one, is that we really try to approach it from the standpoint of being helpful and explaining why QBS is the best procurement method available for the procurement of engineering and professional services. But that said, there are times when you have to kind of go to battle, and sometimes these battles can be pretty protracted and divisive. And so one of the issues out there, however, is the jurisdiction. There's a jurisdictional component of this, and you'll get situations where in Washington, let me back up. In Washington, we have a mini Brooks Act that really is where I do most of my work. It's not the federal level Brooks Act, but our own local state jurisdiction and statutes. And it is very comprehensive. It is state all the way down to all jurisdiction levels. So it includes that small city or school district or water district. And there is, again, this educational component. What we run into is we'll get into battles about, well, does the scope of work really include engineering? Because that's where in Washington it really is an initial dividing line, which is, are they procuring engineering services or architecture services? And so you'll get into discussions about scopes. And unfortunately, there's no enforcement mechanism in our statutes. There's no, neutral party that we can go to say, hey, is this, required to follow QBS or not? And what I've done is kind of used more recently a secondhand way of doing that in a way, which is I have a good relationship with our director of the Board of Licensing. And the Board of Licensing, engineering licensing are the experts about what constitutes engineering. So a couple of times now, I have reached out to him and said, would you take a look at this scope? And do you think that engineering is implicated in this? And would you provide an opinion? And he's done that in an informal way. And that has been successful in getting jurisdictions to move off their argument that number one, first of all, does QBS even apply? Once you get past that kind of foundational argument of whether it applies, the most common one, and it occurs all the time and throughout the United States, is price. There'll be a price component, and those are usually pretty easy to shoot down. We have what's generically called a dear butthead letter. I say that tongue in cheek because, again, we try to be respectful and educational. But at some point when you have repeated violators, you start to get a little frustrated. But those are the simple ones. Although price can be hidden as well when you start getting into, they'll ask for detailed levels of effort, and they already have, you've done prior work, and they have a good idea what your rates are and other firms' rates are. And so when you get into the detailed levels of effort, then we make the argument that they really are gaining access to information about pricing and overall project cost at the initial status or initial submission phase. And the other one where we really run into some arguments and have had some success is using QBS as the foundation, is situations where they require you to either not object to terms and conditions in advance, or they will say, object to any terms and conditions that you find disagreeable in advance of submission. Point those out, and then we've had situations where your objection is actually scored. If you object to the terms and conditions, it's used as a negative score against you. And we make the objection based on QBS, because in Washington, it says that you will make a selection based upon qualifications. And once the most qualified firm is identified, only then will you negotiate a contract at a reasonable price. It doesn't say negotiate price. And that's what the owners of these jurisdictions would like to do, is just negotiate the price. But that's not what state law says. It says negotiate a contract at a reasonable and a fair and reasonable price. So we have been able to use the kind of temporal aspects of the process to also defend the use and in the full application of qualifications-based selection. I'm sure more things will come up over time, but one of the things that we are launching in Washington is off of the Research Institute's work and Paul's work, that we are going to be going around and offering our own training, not only to public owners, but also to our own members, because so many younger people are within their workforces and don't have an appreciation for why QBS is important. So I think it's a continual process of not only educating owners, but also our own members. Thank you.
Thanks, Van. Great stuff, and a great point in there that I think shouldn't be missed, which is that in almost every state, even where QBS is the law and is required, and of course where federal dollars are included, it's required everywhere, regardless of whether they have a state law, because the Brooks Act applies. There's not really an enforcement mechanism. There's not a QBS police at the state level that you can dial 911 for. To have them go talk to the bad guys. It really does come down to your ACEC national advocacy staff and your ACEC at the MO level, at the state level, being that enforcement mechanism. And of course, some of that is pointing out what the law is and what the law requires. Some of that is pointing out why they actually should want to do this, even if the law didn't require it. And that usually is helpful as well. I'm going to throw this out to Matt and Van and myself. We got a question in the chat, and the question is, do we find that resistance to the adoption of QBS comes largely from staff, procurement or purchasing staff, or from the elected officials, mayors or councilors or commissioners? And they're particularly interested in this question as it applies to major metropolitan areas and counties. So whoever wants to take that one first, Van, maybe?
Yeah, Washington State, like you said, it's top down. So it's not a question of adoption; it's a question of implementation. And we find that it's a mix. I mean, in major metropolitan areas, King County, which is where Seattle is located, in the largest, most populated county in the state, we have procurement people that really we have a hard time with, and I think, in some respects, it's twofold. One is they are not experienced. They've had tremendous turnover in their procurement department. And the second one is they are rushed for time. And they treat QBS procurements, not knowing better, like low bid, which is, for a procurement person, it's, here are the steps you follow. It's check the box. And QBS is nuanced and it is scalable, and they really need to think about how they implement the procurement and use the process to match the project. And they don't have the background, I think, to do that in a meaningful way. And so they do whatever they can to get by it, to get past it. And the other thing King County doesn't do is bring in their project people to be part of the process. They keep them at arm's length. And I think that's a huge, huge detriment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, in Georgia, our experience has been that most of the larger, more sophisticated jurisdictions use QBS, even though it's not required at the local level in Georgia. It's only required at the state agency level. And our municipal association and our county commission association both promulgate QBS as a best practice. The resistance that we get is to expansion of it or adoption of it at the local level as a requirement. Cities and counties don't like to be told what to do, particularly by the Georgia General Assembly. And so that's a kind of a Pavlovian response that they have to any sort of mandate from the legislature. The challenge is they struggle with how that would be implemented for small, sort of unsophisticated local governments. How would they implement that? How would that look like? And on that point, Matt, do you want to add anything here on?
No, just real briefly, I would agree with both of you. I think, and what I've seen in my experience, it is a question of education and familiarity. The experienced operators know the benefit of QBS as well as the requirements of QBS. It's the unsophisticated or inexperienced procurement officials, and then on the elected side, the county commissioners or boards or whatever, they just don't know. And so, to the point that you made in the intro, low bid is intuitive and well understood. And that's kind of their point of reference to start with. So there's just the misunderstanding or mischaracterization that if it's not low bid, then it's more expensive, and then that goes to the value of the Research Institute report and materials, right?
No, I think that's a great point. Since you brought it up, why don't you expand on that, Matt, and talk about some of the tremendous resources that ACC National and the ACC Research Institute have created for this education process around the country and in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and you hinted at it earlier. What I really like about the tenor and tone of the report, as well as the accompanying communications materials, is that it can be used both in a proactive and a reactive way, where you're responding to violations or potential violations, but speak to the merits. Not only do you need to do this because that's what the law requires, this is why it is in your best interest to do it. This is why it makes the most sense. Here are all the benefits. So even if you have discretion and it's not a requirement, but it's permissible, here's why you ought to be following QBS. And so the Research Institute material. So you have the underlying report and the data, which is phenomenal. And we've heard from a number of member organizations who respond to requests from the DOT, whether it's the secretary or commissioner level or chief engineer, who just say, look, we need data to understand why you say that QBS is cheaper. Well, now we have that data in the report that we can provide. So that's a great asset. And then there are accompanying infographics and summary materials and primers, which kind of dumb it down, from a communications and PR standpoint for that sort of 30-second elevator exposure, whether it's to a state legislator or, again, a county official or somebody. There's other materials that are available then for that outreach and education. And then the last piece that we've developed, this is for the member organization directors, is a sample PowerPoint presentation, similar to what Paul went through earlier on this program, which can be used and modified for state-specific utilization in that outreach and education, both in a proactive and a reactive way. So it's just a suite of resources available on the website, which are going to equip all of us in this ongoing effort.
Well, it's a tremendous suite of resources, and another thing that's tremendous about it is that it evolves in real time. So as we're using these materials at the state or federal level and getting reactions or feedback or responses from the intended audience or the folks that are using those materials, we can react to that and modify the materials in real time to make them even better and more effective, which is also a tremendous asset, both at the state and at the national level. And it's about education at the end of the day. I think that's really what the resistance is. It's not a visceral opposition to the use of QBS. It's a lack of understanding of QBS. And once you work them through that, in most cases, they become champions for QBS. But we did have an interesting question in the chat, Dr. Chanowski, about smaller jurisdictions. We did one of the focuses of this report that's different from the 2009 report was a focus on local governments. And the question is, it would seem that smaller jurisdictions would get more out of QBS since they don't have broad staffs and experience and expertise to guide the project development. The question is, did the study find anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did. What's interesting with smaller jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, is their first priority that they talk about is we don't have a lot of expertise. We don't have a lot of time. We're doing 5 different jobs. And so we're doing the thing that is the most expedient. And what they have been, many of them been told is QBS takes extra time. And they're like, we don't have extra time. And so, yes, the ones who are using it absolutely are saying, oh, we see the benefit. This is great. We've got great partnerships. It's an education thing that we have to get over. They're hearing this is complex. It's going to take more time. And then they're like, we can't do this. So the ones who are doing it, absolutely, they're seeing the benefits. And that's what we have to show more of and really get aggressive about. QBS is not more time, more money, that it really is for the overall project a benefit for them.
No, that's a great point. Great point. Well, we've got an active chat, so let's keep taking the questions from the chat. Matt, I guess this would go to you. Does ACC National have a brief or a white paper or similar document that any state can use and attach to letters that they're sending to non-compliant agencies? It seems like people are out there creating their own similar documents, and is there a national version that folks could use?
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, I think the primer that's on the Research Institute website, the QBS Resource Center, would be a good starting point for that. And then, yeah, I know that you and your colleagues all have form letters. I won't use the term the van indicators.
We call them
I don't like to make a practice of calling our public agency clients by names, but I know Jen's joking about that too.
We call them
so yeah, but those materials are great for doing that intervention, and we can certainly assist if there's missing pieces to that. We can certainly assist from our end.
I think there's also, so there's an organization, maybe some of our participants are not familiar with, called NACE, the National Association of Engineering Council Executives. That's me and Van and all the people like us around the country. We also have an online resource with go-by documents like that in there that we share with each other to keep each other from having to reinvent the wheel. So that's also another resource that I think is out there.
The other comment I'll make, and we just circulated this last week again to that same group. Our CEO, Linda Baradar, put together an open letter and an accompanying fact sheet that outlines the QBS requirements on various federal infrastructure programs with a specific eye toward implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's so much more money flowing now to particularly local entities that may not be familiar with federal rules and requirements. So we wanted to have, again, just a 2-page primer on, here are the rules, the baseline rules and expectations with links to additional materials that we made available to our state organizations. And that cover letter and or the fact sheet can be used in a similar way to outreach to those partnering organizations to educate them.
No, that's a great point too. Got some active chat questions. There's one question here. How do you address pushback from constituents that suggest QBS limits opportunity for small, disadvantaged, or new startup companies? I'll start by saying I think it's a misunderstanding of the Q in QBS. Qualifications-based selection is really supposed to be specific to the project. It's not some abstract, objective, most qualified firm in the world to do all of the things. It's what firms are most qualified to do this thing. And the local jurisdiction or the state agency or whoever is promulgating that project, they can define what those qualifications are. And they could, for example, say we want a firm that's that's small, or we want a firm that's close by our jurisdiction, or a firm that has a history with our jurisdiction. They can have those qualifications be whatever is appropriate for their needs as the owner and for that project. And so I would suggest that anybody who think that, my opinion would be anybody who suggests that that's not the case, that it would disadvantage DBE firms or small firms, doesn't understand that Q component. But also a lot of local governments don't understand that Q component. And that's part of the educational process, is educating them that, they define what those qualifications are. I don't know if Van or Matt, if you guys want to add anything to that one about disadvantage for small firms in QBS.
Yeah, I'll add one part to that, Sully, which is we have public owners that will actually require some of those individuals from those firms to actually be part of the interview team. And so that it's not only the qualifications as you refer to, but also the ability to get these smaller firms, disadvantaged firms into that process. And so you're not just putting a piece of paper in front of the owner and saying, oh, we will use this firm. It's actually integrating them into the team, into the whole process. And these public owners are viewing it as a capacity building measure. And so that these teams learn, what does it take? What is talked about? What are the questions? How are they answered? So I think it's a positive step.
Yeah.
And as just as another example, I'm in the Federal Highway Administration regulations with respect to federal aid highway program, and they try to strike that balance between promoting small business and DBE utilization as factors in the selection criterion, but they limit it to 10% in terms of scoring, and there's no quotas or set asides. So you'd be consistent with, again, to that qualifications-based selection, but understanding that, whether it's small business, DBE, or even like a local office presence, that there are substantive merit then to those participants in the program and in the selection.
And of course, any agency or jurisdiction that wanted to impose some sort of quota or requirement for the use of DBE firms, for example, the Georgia DOT has a 12% requirement for state projects, and they use QBS. So it's not disadvantaging those firms. They could put, separate and apart from how they procure, they could put those requirements in place separate, and they would apply whether they were using low bid or whether they were using QBS. All right, well, let's take some more questions from our audience. I'm in Michigan. We do not have a mini Brooks bill at this time, maybe soon. We have a member firm that thinks that they found a workaround on QBS. They work to convince their clients that a design build option is preferable, and then their firm is the designer. How would you suggest that we combat this attempt to get around QBS?
I'll start with just a couple of comments. One, again, to praise the work of the Research Institute, there's a separate study that was just recently released on design build and progressive design build and all alternative delivery systems. And much like the QBS study, doing project research and surveys and interviews with procurement officials and with member firms to identify a number of current challenges and then best practices in design build procurement. So much like the QBS study, that design build study is a great resource as we educate and do outreach on best practices for design build. The other comment I make would be, I would hope that the move to design build would be based on project needs, not on an attempt to skirt or get around QBS, because that's backwards and wrong-headed. And in fact, part of the ACEC's priorities and advocacy with respect to design build is making sure that there is a very strong qualifications-based selection component to those procurement, whether that's a two-step requirement, as we see in the federal space, to make sure that there's review qualifications up front, as well as making sure that's a strong component of the overall scoring and selection process as well, and that's embedded in the Research Institute findings there. So even if you do design build, there still ought to be a very strong QBS component to that, even if it's not sort of pure QBS as we see in design build.
Yep. But thanks to the Research Institute, the ACC Research Institute, for creating two great resources that kind of tie together on that particular question. Kind of a related question, and Van, I think you brought this up earlier, is what is design, what is subject to QBS, and the question is that in this particular jurisdiction, they're seeing cities and counties and universities requesting fees for vertical and horizontal infrastructure assessments. And they believe they get around QBS because that's not design. Usually their MO is able to stop that by sending a nastygram to those agencies, but sometimes they have to go to the elected officials. Do we see this as a growing trend across the country?
I'm not sure about across the country, but through my time period of 8 years with ACC, it's been a kind of a continual kind of issue. I wouldn't say it's one of the largest, of course, but yes, I mean we do see it as an issue, and it's one of those things again that's what constitutes the practice of engineering. And in Washington, if you look at the licensing statute, and I think that's where you go, is that it's not design that constitutes engineering. It's the use of your training, education, and judgment that is engineering. So whether you're providing stamped drawings is irrelevant. Are you using that skill set that requires licensing to practice? In this particular case, I would certainly say that's exactly why they're backing off, is because the local MO is making that argument that engineering is in play, and so you have to follow qualification-based selection.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I don't know that I think it's not a growing trend. I think it's, like you said, it's a continuum. It's kind of just the the background noise that exists in the QBS space. And it's part of that constant education piece. Well, on that sort of a related question, who's had some luck in educating the municipal associations or county associations to get them to actually turn out to be supporters of QBS? And I'll just say in Georgia, we have a county commissioners association and we have a Georgia municipal association, and both of those organizations promulgate QBS as a best practice. They don't necessarily want to have it as a mandate, but they do promulgate it as a best practice. And also the American Public Works Association, which is all of the builders of infrastructure around the country, also supports and promulgates QBS as a best practice. And strangely, at least to me as a lawyer, the American Bar Association promulgates QBS as a best practice for procuring services from a risk and a legal standpoint. Let me open that question up. Who's had some luck with municipal associations and counties and turning them into supporters of QBS?
Yeah, likewise, Sully. Not municipal associations, but I was able to be a presenter at an APWA Washington State conference as well as why QBS.
So maybe flipping that question around, how do we approach a client, an owner, who's resistant to changing their procurement practices? And I'll just open that up to everybody. And Paul, maybe we'll start with you. Start with the data. Why is it best for them?
What we found when we've been talking to different people throughout both studies is numbers are convincing. And typically the reluctance is that we've seen people have is getting back to, this is complicated, we don't have time, or we've been working with these people forever, we're attached to them. And when you show them the numbers, here's what the benefits are, they'll quickly at least start paying attention, because ultimately they don't want to procure projects that are going to be cost or time prohibitive. So numbers, going with the facts is the best way to start the conversation.
Couldn't agree more, and it's extremely persuasive. Again, I think that's the tool that turns them in from opponents or not understanding into advocates. Anybody else want to add anything on that? Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna touch a sensitive subject, but it's one that I kind of feel strongly about. What is ACEC doing to educate ACEC member firms and other professionals such as architects who routinely require low bid when they're hiring sub-consultant engineering services, yet they support QBS for the selection of their service? Anybody want to touch that one?
I thought you were going to take it.
I'll take it. I'll take it. I mean, I think it's inconsistent. If qualifications-based selection is the right way to procure engineering services for our clients, it should be the right way to procure engineering services for us. I don't mind saying that out loud. And if anybody wants to take it up with me later, they can give me a call. But I think it's either right or it isn't right. I also think that applies in public or private. A lot of state laws only require to public clients. They don't apply to private clients, but the issue is the same. It's the procurement of engineering services, and it's the best way for owners. It really doesn't matter whether that owner is a public entity or a private entity. And certainly the research backs that up.
Well, the other point I make, and this came clear certainly in the design build study, when you're talking about teaming, but I think the principle is the same with respect to subcontracting or subconsultants as well. Those relationships, those professional relationships, and the role as sort of trusted advisor, to me, is so much more essential to project success than price at the end of the day, for all the reasons that are embedded in Paul's study.
If I may add to that, we have I won't use names, but in Washington State, we have a very successful relationship between a contractor and a designer for DOT projects, for horizontal infrastructure. And they've been very successful, and they do a lot of work together, but it's based on that relationship. We see a lot less success when there are one-offs or contractors treat designers as fungible commodities. And so it's problematic. And I will say that question about the use of design build in lieu of QBS is an issue. And it's one that I think that with time, we have to be better at articulating what are the ins and outs of it.
Well, I think that's a great point. And unfortunately, that's the point we're going to have to end on, because I think we're out of time, and we do want to be sensitive to everybody's time. I think now would be a good time to thank everybody. Thank our panelists for participating today. Thank you to each of you for participating. I'm going to turn it over to Daphne to wrap things up for us.
Thank you, Sully, and thank you for leading us to a great discussion. And just to Van's last point, the relationship piece is important. And if you look at the design build study, that comes out loud and clear in that study as well. So have a look at that as well. I do want to thank you, Sully, for moderating our great panel. Matt, Van, Paul, thank you all for sharing your expertise, your experience. And most importantly, thank you to the audience. You guys were a great, engaging audience, lots of good questions and dialogue. Sorry we didn't get to quite all of them, but I think we hit on the vast majority. And with that, I just want to again thank the ACEC Research Institute donors who made the research possible, make these sessions possible. We couldn't do this without you. For any of you in the audience that are interested in joining this list of firms and individuals who are supporting our efforts, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about that opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you on the next roundtable discussion. Have a great holiday season and stay well. Thank you.